I'm Shahar Azani, and in the news, UNRWA, UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees in the Near East, and its rejection of the Trump peace plan. On January 28, 2020, US President Donald Trump formally unveiled a plan in the White House alongside Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu titled Peace to Prosperity, a vision to improve the lives of the Palestinian and Israeli people, commonly known as the Trump peace plan or the deal of the century. It's a proposal by the Trump administration to resolve the years-long Israeli-Palestinian conflict based on work that's been done on the ground for the past 3 years. Shortly after the plan was announced, Saunders, Interim Commissioner General of UNRWA, criticized the plan, stating that the plan is extremely unsettling for the Palestine refugees living under occupation, under blockade, and through conflict after conflict, crisis after crisis, hoping for justice and human rights. Today, he mentioned, more than ever, there is a need for stability, and today the international community must send a clear message to Palestine refugees and to the world at large that the international community stands firmly behind them. Oh, just to remind you, this is not a statement made by a Palestinian official, but supposedly a representative of the United Nations, even though you can easily get confused by listening to it. In response, Israel's foreign ministry stated firmly that statements criticizing the US peace plan made by UNRWA's acting general commissioner are unacceptable and in blunt contrast to the commitment of the United Nations officials to uphold neutrality and impartiality. It's another proof that UNRWA is part of the problem and not part of the solution. So what is UNRWA? UNRWA is a UN agency created in December of 1949 and still going strong today in 2020. Originally, it was meant to support the efforts of relief for Palestinian refugees, a term which itself has been the subject of much controversy. The UNRWA definition of refugee covers Palestinians who fled or were expelled from their homes during Israel's War of Independence, as well as those who fled or were expelled during the 1967 Six-Day War and their patrilineal descendants. Today, in what seems to be contradictory to its mission, UNRWA continues to grow. Originally intended to provide jobs on public works projects and direct relief, UNRWA today provides education, healthcare, and social services to the population it supports. Currently, more than 5.5 million Palestinians, 5.5 million. They are registered with UNRWA as refugees. Aid is provided in 5 areas of operation: Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. UNRWA also provided relief originally to Jewish and Arab Palestinian refugees inside the State of Israel following the 1948 War of Independence, until the Israeli government took over responsibility for the Jewish refugees in 1952. There are no more Jewish refugees. The UN General Assembly has repeatedly renewed UNRWA's mandate, most recently on December 13, 2019, extending it until June 30th, 2023. UNRWA is the only UN agency dedicated to helping refugees from a specific region or conflict, and it is separate from the UNHCR. Formed in 1950, the United Nations High Commission on Refugees is the main UN refugee agency, and it is responsible for aiding refugees all over the world. Unlike UNRWA, the UNHCR has a specific mandate to aid its refugees to eliminate their refugee status by local integration in current country, by resettling them in third countries, or repatriating them when and if possible. Contrary to UNRWA, UNHCR has been rather successful in achieving its goal, whereas the numbers of refugees dealt by UNRWA keeps on growing. UNRWA, on the other hand, allows refugee status to be inherited by descendants of male refugee, patrilineal, we said, including legally adopted children. In August of 2018, the US administration decided to defund UNRWA. The US announced that it will no longer fund UNRWA's operation. They called it irredeemably flawed operation. The US contributed about 1/3 of UNRWA's budget. Blaming UNRWA and other international donors for failing to reform the organization's way of doing business, quote unquote, among the US's many complaints about the agency, it was mentioned that the United Nations calculates the number of Palestinians officially recognized as refugees to be a major issue. The United States emphasized it would like to change the number from more than 5.5 million who are counted today to the few hundred thousand alive when the agency was created 7 decades ago. That is, according to US officials at the time. The issue of UNRWA, Palestinian refugees, and the so-called right of return is one of the most contentious and crucial issues to understand and address today in the framework of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Therefore, is the importance of our piece today. To dive into the details of this consequential topic, I am pleased to have with me from Israel, Adi Schwartz. Adi is an Israeli academic, researcher, and author. His work focuses on the Arab-Israeli conflict and Israeli history and current affairs. He is the co-author of the book, The War of Return. Together with Dr. Einat Wilf, they have composed a compelling, and might I add, fascinating read for all those truly interested in understanding the roots of the problem between Israel and the Palestinians. Together, Adi and Einat explore the roots of Palestinian so-called right of return and present it to be what it is, one of the largest obstacles to successful diplomacy and lasting peace in the region. Adi, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Pleasure to be with you, Shahar.
So, to dive into this crucial and very interesting topic, maybe you can share with our viewers a little bit about the beginning. UNRWA was established for the purpose of assisting refugees, but it seems that something has gone wrong along the way. Something shifted. What happened?
Yes, that is correct. In the beginning, we could say that UNRWA was a very benign organization, very positive. And the outlook was the Americans and the British who wanted to create UNRWA thought that through putting money and investments and finding new jobs and housing, the political problem could be solved. Now, the Americans and the British had good precedents. The Americans did quite the same in Europe. Europe after World War II was, of course, a devastated continent, and we know that the Marshall Plan worked tremendously well. The same thing happened in Korea. After a devastating war in the beginning of the 50s, the Americans and, in fact, the international community has decided to do everything it could to promote South Korea, and bring it back to normal life. South Korea was one of the poorest countries on earth, and in the 80s and onwards, it became one of the top countries in the world. So the precedents were there, and the Americans thought that they could do the same in the Middle East. The problem was that there was an unwillingness on the side of the Palestinians, mainly the Palestinians themselves, the Palestinian refugees, and the Arab countries, who for political reasons, and that is the big difference between them and the Germans and the Koreans, etc., the Palestinian refugees simply did not want to be resettled. And unfortunately, that is the situation to this day.
But let me just pause you for a minute. I just want to understand. UNRWA is established in 49. UNHCR is established in 1950. Was there any decision at any point maybe to put UNRWA under UNHCR, or what brought about the establishment of a separate whole agency just for one people?
Well, that is a fascinating chapter, actually, that we detail in our book. You're exactly right. In 1949, UNRWA was created, and then after a few months, discussions began in the United Nations to create the worldwide agency, UNHCR. And at the moment, the Arab countries, and we have that on record, that is Lebanon, Egypt, etc., other countries, Saudi Arabia, understood that the international community has no intention whatsoever to return refugees, to repatriate refugees, they demanded that the Palestinian refugees would not be part of UNHCR. So they understood clearly that the international norms and the international attitude, the normal, the usual way the world worked, was not in favor of return. And when they understood that, they were adamant that the Palestinian refugees should not be part of the international organization, which is the UNHCR.
And,
so
and
from
the US
then,
and the US
yes.
and Britain simply went along?
Yes, because the UNRWA was already existing, and they made this clause of. You have to remember that the Americans and the British thought that UNRWA was a temporary organization of 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. They did not have in mind the situation that we're in today of 70 years. So for them, it wasn't that important. 1 year, 2 year, and the issue of the Palestinian refugees would be over. They did not foresee the plan or the script that the Palestinians saw.
I have to put this in front of you, Adi. You're thinking about the term refugee. And first of all, the numbers have risen to 5.5 million. Maybe if you can elaborate a little bit about the numbers and where exactly these refugees are. And most importantly, when people think about refugee, there is a certain image that comes to mind. Is this the case when it comes to Palestinian refugees under the care of UNRWA?
So, first of all, regarding numbers, UNRWA registers today some 5.5 million refugees. And again, this is the only number, this is the only group whose number only rises. So as you said in the beginning, from initially 700,000 refugees in 1948, we now have 5.5 million. And that is the only group of refugees. None of them was, even one, wasn't resettled. So this is the only group on Earth. Now, of that 5.5 million refugees, we have 2.2 million who live in Jordan. That's another very interesting issue that we mention in the book, because all of them, 2.2 million, that is 40% of the overall refugee population, have Jordanian citizenship. So this is an unprecedented situation. No other refugee in the world, including in Sudan, in Africa, in the Balkans, whatever you want, none of them have a new citizenship. Now, the whole refugee regime is intended to help people who do not have the protection of another country, meaning that they do not have a citizenship. And in Jordan, you have this very strange situation where 40% of the registered group have a new citizenship. So that is 2.2 million who live in Jordan. Another 2.2 million live in what you can call British Mandate of Palestine. So that's the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And then the last million that you have is supposedly divided between Lebanon and Syria. And I'm saying supposedly because actually the numbers are much lower. We know from a census in Lebanon that instead of 500,000 refugees who are supposed to be in Lebanon, there are actually only 170,000. So that's 1/3. The numbers are inflated 3 times regarding Lebanon. And regarding your question of what does it mean to be a Palestine refugee? So if you look at Jordan, for example, which is 40% of the population, then you would not recognize the refugees. They're not different from other Palestinians living in Jordan or even Jordanian. Most of them live in normal neighborhoods. They have concrete buildings, they have cars, they have works. Some of them are lawyers, doctors. They run normal lives, and they're simply registered for political reasons as refugees. The same is true for the West Bank. If you look at what has been called refugee camps, one might think of devastated and hunger-stricken people in a war-torn area, but this is not the case. This is not the case. These are regular neighborhoods, perhaps middle class. Some of them can be lower middle class. Some of them can even be upper middle class. They have cars. They have jobs. Just one caveat, that the situation in the Gaza Strip and in Lebanon is a little bit different. There, the situation is a little bit, it's worse. But as regards to the West Bank...
There you mean in Lebanon?
I mean in Lebanon, in the Gaza Strip.
Oh, okay.
The situation is worse. But as for the West Bank and for Jordan, they certainly look like simply any other neighborhood.
And when you're saying their situation is a bit worse, you're talking about their conditions of living due to the realities in those regions.
Yes, but that is also something that we have to clarify. If you look into the housing, and we have data regarding, for example, electricity equipment, so refrigerators and ovens and mobile phones. So this is 80 or 90% in the Gaza Strip and in Lebanon, people who have every electricity equipment that you can imagine. So this is not exactly the classical refugee image that we have.
So I'm just listening to you and I'm completely baffled. We have a UN agency that's established to alleviate the situations of refugees, understanding that the hope is to, of course, eliminate that status and integrate these people into normal life. And it doesn't happen. It's being used as a international political bargaining chip. Maybe focus us for a minute. It sounds like one big scam. What is behind all of this elaborate operation? Maybe speak to that for a minute.
So yes, as we just said before, this started out as a very positive project. But the problem is that the Palestinians, as we said, did not want to be resettled. Now, I'll take you back to the 50s. This is the Cold War, where the Americans have a very large stake at maintaining the oil flow and preventing the Arab world from falling into the hands of the Soviet Union. And we found in the book, actually, a few documents, a few telegrams of the State Department, the American State Department, detailing how actually the Arab world simply put an ultimatum to the Americans saying, don't do anything to UNRWA, because the Americans at a certain point said, okay, this is not working. We found cables running back to Washington saying we do not have the cooperation neither of the Palestinians nor of the Arab governments. UNRWA is a waste of time. We found that back in 1952. 1952, only 3 years after UNRWA was created, American ambassadors in the region write back to Washington saying this is a failed operation and there is no reason to maintain UNRWA. But then the Arab world says to Washington, do not touch UNRWA. UNRWA for us is of very great importance. And the question is why? Why is it so important why was it so important for the Arab world to continue and have UNRWA? And the answer is that the Palestinians and the Arab world decided that as long as the Palestinian refugee issue remains alive, the war isn't over yet. And when I'm saying war, I mean the war against the state of Israel, the war against Zionism. Because back then there was no issue of territories. This was before the 1967, before the Six-Day War. There weren't occupied territories. And the only serious issue open was the issue of the refugees. And the Palestinians understood that if they are to be resettled, then the conflict is over. So their decision not to be resettled was a political decision to not agree to the existence of the state of Israel. And they simply blackmailed the Americans, and the Americans gave up. For them, for the Americans, in the end of the 50s, there were much bigger issues, such as maintaining alliances, and with all due respect, $100 million to throw away, and the Americans knew. The Americans knew from the end of the 50s that this is a failed project, that nothing good is going to be, going to happen because of UNRWA. But they decided, because of more global concerns and maintaining their alliances, keeping the Arab world out of the Soviet reach, they decided to keep UNRWA alive. But for the Arabs, it was very clear. For the Arabs, it was very clear that this is part of the anti-Israeli agenda. As long as the Palestinian refugee problem exists, the war isn't over.
And what you're saying now are statements that resonated in the 50s and 60s, and that still echo today, because to listen to you talk about the Palestinian narrative and their position, it's actually a reflection of where we are today in what they deem to be the so-called right of return. So maybe we can take a minute, because this is an expression that many of our viewers heard over time when it comes to one of the Palestinian demands, the right of return. Can you say something about that right? Does it exist? Has it ever existed? Maybe your take on that?
Yes, that's a very important issue, a crucial issue, because the Palestinians managed in the last few decades to take a political issue, which is the refugee problem, and to disguise it in legal and humanitarian terms. So the Palestinians and their descendants have no such thing as a right of return to the state of Israel. If you look at international law, if you look at legal standards, etc., there is nothing in them that grant a legal right to the Palestinian refugees or their descendants to enter the state of Israel. I'll just give you one example. The Palestinians claim, for example, that a certain UN resolution, 194, promises them or grants them the right of return. Now, first of all, United Nations General Assembly resolutions, 194 is a General Assembly resolution, do not have the power at all to grant rights or to create international law. That is according to the United Nations Charter. So one cannot even say anything that 194 grants them any right. But even if you look into that decision, you get a sense of how tricky is the thing and what a sense of deception is. Because 194, that decision, was a decision by the United Nations to try to create a platform for a peace agreement between Israel and the Arab countries at the end of the War of Independence. That's in 1948. Now, what the Palestinians did back then, and still today, they took out all the clauses that they did not like. I'll give you just one example. Number 10. Clause number 10 said back then that the Arab world and everybody should create an atmosphere which is good for economy. What did the Arab world did in 1949? They boycotted Israel. They blocked all commerce, and there was none between Israel and Arab countries. So what the Palestinians did was to take just one article from that decision, number 11, and say that this gives them the right to return to Israel.
Based on what you said, do you think the Palestinians will ever concede, give up, or compromise on their demand for a right of return for millions of Palestinians from outside of Israel into Israel? To them, can it be said, because some people claim that this is just a bargaining chip for them, and once real negotiations start, there is room for compromise? Is there?
No. So I think that this is a crucial point, because this is not a bargaining chip. And in fact, I think that this was the main mistake of the peacemakers that were so concerned and thought that at the heart of the matter there is an issue of territory. And they indeed thought that the issue of the refugees was indeed a bargaining chip. So if we look back, and this is what we did in the book, we look back at the last 25 or even 30 years of what's been called the peace process. And we went into the documents and into the Palestinian documents themselves and into the responses that they gave to the Clinton parameters, etc., etc. We see that at no moment whatsoever the Palestinians were willing to forgo what they call the right of return. So for them, there is no way to give up on the right of return. This is the heart of the Palestinian ethos, the heart of the Palestinian narrative, that they were an indigenous group that were kicked out of their houses, and that this was an injustice, and the only way to correct it is to bring back the refugees.
So let me ask you something, Adi. What you're telling us is rather harsh. It provides a very small, if at all, sliver of hope. So maybe, because we have a few minutes left, maybe you can say something about what do you think can be actually done to untangle this Gordian knot for the benefit of everyone? Is there anything that can actually happen?
So yes, I think on the one hand, it is harsh because we have to understand the true root of the conflict. But on the other hand, there is room for optimism, because until now, because we haven't discussed this issue, the Palestinians did not get the message that this is unacceptable. Now, the West, I think, and this is regarding the United States and the European Union, etc., have to send a very clear message that if the Palestinians are interested in creating their own future, in building their own state, prosperous, etc., they will help them. But if their only wish is to ruin the state of Israel, then they're not going to give them even $1. And this is the message, and I think that people do change. So in due time, in course time, I don't think it will happen tomorrow, but this is perhaps months, years, or even decades. But the message must be very clear. The Palestinians must be isolated in the maximalist vision that the whole of the land will be theirs. Until now, they're not getting this message. Until now, they're getting the message that everything that they're doing is good. The onus is set on Israel. Israel is supposed to suggest more and more concessions. And this issue of the root cause, the narrative, the basic ethos of the Palestinians of return was never touched upon.
Adi, looking forward and not backward and recognizing reality of the ground, I hear you loud and clear, and I do hope that all of our viewers do as well. Thank you so much for joining us on JBS. The War of Return, a bestseller in Israel and highly recommended. The book is out in English on April 28th. It's available for pre-order now. This is one book which is certain to spark lively debate and infuse new ideas into an old conversation. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and elsewhere. In truth, there is nothing more that the majority of Israelis desire than peace. It is all too easy to point the finger at Israel every time, and it's all too easy to forget that it was Israel of its own volition who chose to take a leap of faith in 1993 and enter into the Oslo Accords. And it was Israel who was hurt when those euphoric images and visions of peace clashed with the reality of blood streaming down the streets as a result of Palestinian suicide terror attacks. It's been over 25 years since those times and the Oslo Accords. And in spite of their sweet talk aimed at foreign ears, as opposed to what is mostly spoken at home and in Arabic, Palestinians adamantly refuse to truly accept Israel as a legitimate neighbor and partner for peace. They seem to harbor a delusion that Israel will simply go away, vanish, disappear. Understanding the true Palestinian position means listening to what they say, really listening. Listen when they deny the Jewish connection to Jerusalem. Listen when they claim there was never a Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Yasser Arafat famously told President Clinton in Camp David about the Jewish temple. He said, "There is nothing there. There was a temple in Nablus, not Jerusalem." Clinton was stunned. Frankly, so should we. Same with the Palestinian War of Return, as we so eloquently heard from Adi, and look at the book. This is a baseless demand, which is no more and no less than a call to eliminate Israel as a Jewish state. Most Israelis are united in our desire for peace, but it seems the term Palestinian state is more of a battle cry than a true desire on their end to build one. It is only when Palestinians choose to awaken from those delusions that we may all move in the direction of realizing the dream of peace. May it be. I thank our director, Sloan Copeland, JBS's managing director, Dara Golub, technical manager, Michael Paley, transmission manager, John McDevitt, and to the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. And for JBS, I'm Shahar Azani. Until next time, see you soon and להתראות.